Okay, let's get started. I want to start first and foremost, of course, with a huge thank you to our guest today, Dr. Victor Shih. A few announcements quickly, and then we'll get started. This series is made possible, and it's presented by the California State University San Bernardino History Department, the History Club, Phi Alpha Theta, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, who support the events, the Jack Brown College of Business and Public Administration, and the Intellectual Life Fund. I also want to thank my sometime co-host, Alexander Serrano, who is a co-organizer of this series, and he's now headed off to get started on his PhD over at UC Santa Barbara. He is a graduate of our BA and MA programs here in history, and he's off to his PhD program in East Asian languages and cultural studies. So thank you to Alexander, and good luck with his next adventures. And I also want to thank Pam Crossan here in the history department, who organizes so many aspects of these events and keeps us moving. Our guest today is Dr. Victor Shih of the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Shih holds a BA from George Washington University and a doctorate in government from Harvard University. Victor Shih is an expert on the politics of Chinese banking policies, fiscal policies, and exchange rates, as well as the elite politics of China, which is what I think we're going to hear a bit about today. He's the author of 2 books published both by Cambridge University Press. First, Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation. And most recently, just out this year, Coalitions of the Weak, Elite Politics in China, from Mao's Stratagem to the Rise of Xi Jinping. He is also editor of Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability, Duration, Institutions, and Financial Conditions, published by the University of Michigan Press. And I'll send out links to these books for anybody who wants to grab them. And I assume you're going to want to grab the one that we hear about today, Coalitions of the Weak. So I'll send out a link to the Cambridge University Press site. And if you want to go buy it from someone else, you can do that. But I'll send the Cambridge University Press link, and you can find it there as well. Professor Shih also has published widely in a number of journals, including the American Political Science Review, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, the China Quarterly, and Party Politics. He is currently Associate Professor of Political Economy at UCSD and is the Ho Mu Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations. He's currently engaged in the study of the activities of the Chinese elite and of Chinese defense firms around the world. And he is also maintaining a large database on biographical information of elites in China. We will also share that. Professor Shih sent that over to me, and I put it in the chat for those who joined early. And I will resend those things. I'll send a few notes in the chat for everybody so that you can see that database, which I've just learned about and will definitely be using in future teaching. It looks really, really comprehensive. At the UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategy, or GPS, Professor Shih teaches courses including Financing the Chinese Miracle, Chinese Sources and Methods, Chinese Politics, and Political Economy of Authoritarian Regimes. Prior to joining UCSD, Professor Shih was a professor of political science at Northwestern University and is a former principal for the Carlyle Group. And again, I'll share links to Professor Shih's faculty profile, Cambridge University Press page for his recent books as well. To everybody joining, please feel free to go ahead and type in questions or comments in the chat. You can chat them directly to me, or you can send them so that everybody can see them. I think everybody has that option. You don't have the option to unmute. That's just Professor Shih and me for Zoom bombing purposes. However, in the Q&A, if you'd prefer to ask your questions live, we can do that on a case-by-case. So if you want to raise your hand or just indicate in the chat that you want to ask a live question, we're more than happy to do that. Okay, I think that's everything. Please join me in welcoming Professor Victor Shih.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Of course, a proud member of the UCSD community as a recipient of a UCSD PhD in history, studying with the great Joe Eschrich, who's actually giving a talk, I think in late October or something, on his new book, which is on the Yan'an period, which is of great interest to me. Is I think I will be there for that for sure. Anyway, great to be here. And among my many roles at UCSD, one of the things that I'm involved with is our master's program in Chinese public policy and economy called the MCPA program. If you're interested in China, especially contemporary China, for the history of China, you can continue the study with Professor Murray here. But if you're interested in contemporary China and studying it rigorously with the latest data and methods, I would urge you to consider that program. Okay, so today I am going to talk about my new book. So I'm just share screen here. Can you guys see it? Great. So I'm just gonna start with this. So this is cover my book. Interestingly, the reason why I chose this cover for the book is because these are not the people. So this is basically China's leadership after Chairman Mao had died in 1976. But these are not necessarily the people that you would think would be in charge of a communist dictatorship. So, you know, some people have these notions that, oh, in authoritarian regimes, you can pick the, you know, whoever you want to be leaders. So obviously you pick like the best people, right? And that's sort of, you know, at least some people believe that. So let me tell you about the people who are on stage here. On the right, you have Li Xiannian, who really is one of the main actors of my book. He, in his file, it says he's a counter-revolutionary splittist. So he tried to split, actually he didn't try, he did participate in a plot to split the Chinese Communist Party when the party faced its greatest challenge in the middle of the Long March on the verge of extinction. And nonetheless, he became one of the most powerful leaders of China and the longest serving vice premier of China. Just next to him is Ye Jianying. Ye Jianying was the person who accused Li Xiannian and others of splitting the party, but he actually did not have his own faction in the military. In fact, he was one of the weakest military leaders in the People's Liberation Army, that for whatever reason, Mao put him in charge of the military planning, at least in the General Staff Department, over and over again. The person in the middle was kind of like a governor of a state, you know, before the Cultural Revolution. But then, you know, kind of 10 years later, he found himself to be the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Hua Guofeng. And then you have Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, of course, was a very seasoned revolutionary. But again, he didn't have his own faction in the military or even in the party. He had a kind of a smallish faction in the party, but no faction from the 1930s period, at least, to speak of in the military. And then finally, Wang Dongxing. Wang Dongxing, he was Chairman Mao's bodyguard. Even though he played an important position, his rank was relatively low compared to all the other people. But suddenly he was catapulted into the Politburo Standing Committee, the highest ruling body. So in contrast, you had people like these, Liu Shaoqi, Peng Dehuai. These are very seasoned revolutionaries, each with their, you know, very sizable factions, a lot of political experience, a lot of military experience, extremely smart. Peng Dehuai was educated in Germany. Liu Shaoqi got training from the Communist International, all purged by Chairman Mao in 1966 or even before. So in the case of Peng Dehuai, he was purged even before that. Why is that the case? Why aren't the best, most experienced revolutionaries chosen to be leaders of communist regimes? Why do we have these very marginal, weak, I would call them weak, controversial figures who are literally guilty of splitting the party? Why are they put in charge of communist revolutionary parties? By the way, Stalin did exactly the same thing. I mean, we can talk about that in the Q&A. So what I'm going to talk about mainly today is that this logic continued into the 1980s, where children of very experienced revolutionaries were sidelined in many cases in the 1980s, with very few exceptions. A few of these, we call them Princeling in China studies. They're basically children of first-generation revolutionaries who helped China become a communist regime. Their kids obviously have a lot of connections. They have a lot of political savvy because they grew up in these elite families. They were sidelined. And the result was that there was kind of a political vacuum. The 2 or 3 Princeling children who made it into the political elite in 2012 included one person, Xi Jinping. And that partly explained why he was able to dominate the party so thoroughly as he does today. It's not the complete explanation, obviously, because he's obviously a very daring person, very ambitious. All of that cannot be explained by this framework, but the relative political vacuum that faced him, the lack of competition against him, is partly what explained his rapid consolidation of power, as the last chapter of my book outlines. So that I'm really mainly talking about the last chapter of the book. But I will talk a little bit about the theory, right? So going back to the puzzle of why in communist dictatorships or one-party regimes, if you will, why are there such, patterns of promotion that don't necessarily favor the most experienced, the most capable revolutionaries? You have to go back to, so there's in political science, at least, there's all these theories about how, like, oh, one-party dictatorships, they're very stable because it organizes interests. It provides incentives for people within these revolutionary parties to play by the rules so that they can rise through the ranks. The payoffs to them is very clear because, the higher up you move, the more benefits you receive in the revolutionary party. But, of course, that's all nice. And, I guess statistically, they're a little bit more stable than military dictatorships or to monarchies, at least in the 20th century. But it doesn't mean that things are going well all the time in these single party revolutionary regimes. For one, Stalin purged, i.e. shot, the vast majority of the revolutionary veterans who helped the Bolshevik regime rise to power in the Soviet Union. The Cultural Revolution in China led to the purge. So in China, people were not shot. They were sent to work camps. In the case of Liu Shaoqi, he got very sick. He was locked up in a room and not given any medicine and died of illness there. So the problem is that even some of the closest comrades of Chairman Mao had to be purged according to Mao's perspective. So purges would happen left and right. People get eliminated. And so this is like a perennial problem in a lot of single party dictatorships. The Soviet Union, of course, collapsed after a failed coup. Even in China, which is, pretty stable one-party regime, there were rumors of attempted coups launched by Zhou Yongkang in 2012. Despite an intricate system to evaluate cadres according to merits, single-party regimes routinely produce very mediocre, extremely corrupt, and sometimes very inexperienced leaders. So as you see this phenomenon, which in China we call this helicoptering. So someone very junior level suddenly find themselves at extremely high levels. And that doesn't make sense because, for a revolutionary regime, you would think that you want like very experienced, capable people, but that's often not the people who end up in top leadership. I argue that there's an inherent incentive in authoritarian regimes to favor thinly networked, inexperienced, and politically compromised and corrupt officials. And the whole reason why that's the case is because authoritarian politics is highly uncertain. Unlike in democratic politics, where you know three important pieces of information. So in democratic politics, you know who your enemies are. If you're a Democrat, it's the Republicans. If you're a Republican, it's Democrats. You have a pretty good sense of how powerful your enemies and yourself are. You just do an opinion poll, you get that information. In authoritarian regimes, you're missing all of this information. You don't, everyone's on the same side. Everyone's in the Communist Party. Who's your enemy, right? And even if you think that, oh, that person is my enemy, you don't know how powerful that person is until you get into a clash with the person. Once the clash begins and you say, well, whoever wins is the most powerful one, but by then it's too late. You don't want to wait until that point to find out how powerful you are. So historically, authoritarian leaders pursue several ways of trying to mitigate this information deficit. One is by pursuing factionalism, right? So you rely on people who have had a past record of loyal service to you to fill senior level positions. But this strategy has a limit because your follower can get so powerful that they can challenge your power. This is basically what happened with Lin Biao and what happened to scores of people in the Soviet Union that Stalin thought were too powerful for Stalin, and they had to be executed. The other strategy, which I talk about in my book, is coalitions of the weak. That is, you promote to the top people who are so obviously weak that they can't possibly challenge your power for some time to come, right? So then your odds of winning any internal struggle is always high because you've placed a bunch of extremely weak people in the upper echelon of the party. Why does this work? Replacing powerful veterans with weak officials will increase the dictator's relative power and lessen the probability a rival coalition sufficiently powerful to overthrow the incumbent can form. The other thing also is, in an information-poor environment, the best way to prevent a coup is to know that the elite is too weak to challenge, right? So there's an information premium to having a lot of weak people around you, so that you know they're weak, so you can just sleep, well at night. And then finally, and this is perhaps the most powerful, so basically this strategy is only feasible if there are no other challenges to the regime or the diminished capacity to govern would replace the regime, would place the regime in grave risk, right? So of course, if you put a bunch of weak people in upper echelon, you try to go to war with the United States, it's not going to go very well. But guess what? Mao took care of that by having the Sino-US rapprochement in 1971. Then he purged Lin Biao. Then, as the book outlines, the coalition of the weak was completely in place. And he died very peacefully, in 1976. Who do I mean by the weak? Either very inexperienced officials. So they have very thin networks. I'll try to go through these quickly in the interest of time. They're very thin networks. They don't know how the elite game is played, so they don't dare to transgress what the dictator has told them to do. So they can't possibly challenge the dictator. So that's pretty obvious. The other one are tainted officials. So tainted individuals are defined as actors whose rehabilitation within a given set of institutions requires considerable cost and effort. And this is, it's just, it's like a narrative investment, right? Some groups of individuals or institutions invested in a narrative sometime in the past that, oh, these kinds of people are bad, for us. It creates a stigma against these individuals It's, it's all constructed. I'm not saying this is a real thing or not a real thing, but nonetheless, it's just hard to overturn that conception, right? Once the stigma is created, the taint is created, it's very hard to overturn it. So what does that do? What it does is that basically, short of overthrowing the ruling institutions entirely, the entire regime would have rallied around the incumbent if these tainted individuals had dared to plot against her, against the leader, right? So it makes it really hard for these tainted individuals ever to challenge the dictator's power. And even if a rival coalition had emerged, it would hesitate to form a coalition with these tainted individuals because they're tainted. You don't want to be associated with them. And finally, I think this is the most powerful mechanism, which is that even if the tainted officials had joined the plot, their expected returns were limited by their status, which means that they would prefer the status quo. Why take the risk if no matter what I do, I'm always going to be number 3, number 4 in the regime? Why would I join a coup? It doesn't pay at all to do it. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about these tainted individuals, but if you read the book, I talk about it extensively in the book. But basically, if you look at how connected the average Politburo member is in the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, the 8th Party Congress was before the Cultural Revolution, before Mao pursued this coalition of the weak strategy, whereas the 9th and the 10th Party Congress was when Mao pursued the coalition of the weak strategy. So the y-axis is kind of hard to explain, but it's basically the average Politburo members, with what percentage of the Central Committee did they have a connection? So 40% was the average at the 8th Party Congress, which is quite high. So the average Politburo member had some kind of connections with 40% of the Central Committee. So Central Committee is a body of like 300 officials, whereas the Politburo is a body of like 20, 25 officials. So the Politburo obviously is the ruling body of the Chinese Communist Party. The Central Committee is like Congress, if you will, in China. So, but then by the 10th Party Congress, the average Politburo member had only ties with only 20% of the Central Committee. So basically, these elites have gotten weaker over the course of the last few years of Mao's rule. This is what I'm trying to say in this graph, at least. And basically, one standard deviation below the mean, so the big red line in the middle is the mean or the average. One standard deviation below the mean, you had some Politburo members with no ties with anyone in the Central Committee, which is very interesting. So Mao was promoting these people like Chen Yonggui, Wu Guixian. These were Politburo members who were workers and farmers one day suddenly promoted to be the vice premier of China and a Politburo member. So very extreme kinds of promotion. One outcome of this style of politics is that it become deinstitutionalized. So this is the number of different kinds of meetings in the Chinese Communist Party meetings, state council meetings, National People's Congress meetings. Basically, after 1966, a lot of these meetings just went to zero for some of the years. There were no more meetings anymore. All you need is an audience with Chairman Mao, because he became completely powerful. The rest of the elite were so weak, they had no authorities. You only need to have a group meeting when you have elites each have some authorities of their own. But when they have no authority, except for Chairman Mao, you don't need to have any meetings. You just need to meet with Mao on a one-on-one basis. So that's what ended up happening. Okay, so now finally, I will talk about how this logic played out in the 1980s and how that affected politics today. I think we have time to do that, next 10 to 15 minutes. So what Chairman Mao did late in his life, pursue this coalition of the weak strategy, left China with a group of experienced but roughly equally powerful leaders, especially after the mass rehabilitation of purged veterans. And Deng was the person to rehabilitate these veterans. So I think it is fortunate, I think, for the Chinese Communist Party that Mao did not do what Stalin did. So Stalin just took, hundreds of thousands of people that he had fought with, on the same side, right? So they were all communist, lined them up against a wall and shot them. Chairman Mao did not do that. The vast majority of the people who were purged, they were sent to work farms. Some died of illness, overworking, heart attacks, etc. But the majority survived these work camps, and they were brought back into power by Deng Xiaoping. But because they were brought back into power, you had a lot of revolutionary veterans who were in power by the early 1980s. And they were roughly equally powerful to each other. So there was no dictatorship in China in the 1980s. There was a communist one-party rule, but within the Communist Party, it was leadership by coalition, right? So there's a coalition of, they were the 5 immortals plus, 2 or 3 important individuals. So there's a handful of like 7 to 8 people who collectively governed China in the 1980s. These rehabilitative veterans pursue their own coalition of the weak strategy in the respective sphere of power by promoting young, politically inexperienced technocrats. What's the reason? So the reason is very clear, and they write it themselves. They're like, well, they want to promote people that are young, inexperienced, who would not countermand their decisions, right? So these old veterans, they still wanted to be in charge. They still wanted to be very influential. If you promote someone who's very experienced with a large faction of their own, they are going to start challenging your power very soon. So they promoted these really young people that even after these veterans retired, and Deng Xiaoping made them retired by 1987, they could still kind of pull the strings behind the scenes, because the people that they have nominated to join the leadership, they're so young and so inexperienced. And indeed, that was the politics of the 1980s and even going into the 1990s. In addition, they discriminated against this group called the Princelings. So these were children of veteran revolutionaries out of several reasons. One is because some of them joined the Red Guards. They were beating up their teachers and even government officials at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and that was considered a very bad thing in the 1980s. But in fact, the Princeling Red Guards were fully exonerated by Chen Yun, who was a top leader of China at that time, second only to Deng Xiaoping. So in theory, they should be fine, but then still a lot of the veterans resisted them. The other reason was that the Princelings had very dense political networks with each other and even with some of the other veterans. And basically people, because China was governed by pieces, right? So each one of these veterans was in charge of a piece. It's like, oh, I'm in charge of the central bureaucracy. I'm in charge of this part of the PLA. I'm in charge of that part of the PLA. These veterans just didn't want these Princelings to start exerting their power and influence so early on. So they did not promote a lot of Princelings. But this meant that 10 years later, by the mid to late 2000s, the princelings who were left in politics, who rose up through the ranks, had less competition. And the biggest beneficiary of this, I would argue, was Xi Jinping, the leader of China today. So to give you a sense, there actually are a lot of princelings. The Central Committee members at the 8th Party Congress in 1956, they gave birth to 290 children in total. But only 11 of them ever achieved full ministerial level by 2010. So that's a 3.7% success rate. That's, in my mind, I mean, after all this talks about, oh, princelings have all the advantage and all this stuff, that's a very low ratio. Part of the reason is because many of the parents were purged during the Cultural Revolution. A few of them came back. So, but even if you look at the children of those who came back into power at the 12th Party Congress in 1982, they had 64 children. Only 5 of them made it to a full ministerial level by 2010. It's a higher ratio, 7.8%, but it's still not spectacular. And actually, this number is already downplaying it, because if you include all the generals too, there were like 3 to 400 generals that were given that rank in 1955. If we include their children too, that's like close to 1,000 kids, but very few of them ever made it to a full ministerial level. Although princelings were cultivated, had the best education in China in the 1950s and the early 1960s, as well as the 1980s, when they came back from the Cultural Revolution, they faced barriers from the veterans by the mid to late 1980s. And again, the reason is because some of them belong to this Red Guard, the Western District Picket, who beat up teachers and fellow students. So people in this group include this guy Kong Dan and Bo Xicheng, who's the brother of Bo Xilai. So, oh yeah, I'm okay. Some of them, because of this checkered past, they decided to go into business. So they became wealthy businessmen instead. So there's a long list of people who chose this route, including the son of Deng Xiaoping, who lost his legs because Red Guards pushed him out of a 3-story window. But also people like Wang Jun and Ye Shengji, Qin Xiao, Chen Xiaolu, Yu Zhengsheng. They all went into business. The only person who came back into government successfully was Yu Zhengsheng, who ultimately became a Politburo Standing Committee member. Both the veterans and newly promoted technocrats resisted promoting princelings to vice ministerial and full ministerial level because they're afraid that the princelings would become too vociferous, too meddling, and ultimately take power away from the veterans who were still in charge of these ministries in the 1980s. The people, well, yeah, so then here are some people who did run into outright resistance, the son of Chen Yun, Chen Yuan, the son of Liu Shaoqi, Liu Yuan, the son of Chen Yi, Chen Haosu, and then the daughter of Liu, okay, this got me, this General Liu, I know this is someone in the military, Liu Yandong. They all were, there are clear records of them being vetoed because they were princelings. In contrast, the political and inexperienced technocrats who were always nice, so these technocrats, not only were they knowledgeable and highly educated and inexperienced, they were also very good at kissing up to these veterans. You know, Jiang Zemin famously bought a lot of gifts. So, you know, he was in Shanghai, so he would, every Chinese New Year, every Mid-Autumn Festival around this time, he would take a trainload of gifts, not a literal trainload, but like suitcase full of gifts from Shanghai. Shanghai at the time still was the main place that made fancy desserts in all of China, because Shanghai was a kind of a foreign concession, so it had a lot of, still first-rate bakeries and so on and so forth. So we would take this yuebing, this mooncake, up to Beijing and do his rounds to all the veterans' homes and just hand out desserts, nice clothing, this and that. He would do this every holiday, and it paid off. I mean, Jiang Zemin ultimately was elected to be the top leader of China in 1989. So the reserve cadre system developed in the 1980s involved revolutionary veterans each promoting their favorite young technocrats into vice ministerial level. Instead of the Princelings, the veterans chose always nice people. These are the young, inexperienced technocrats who are very good at kissing up, because the veterans wanted post-retirement influence. The people without networks, they still need the veterans' help to navigate the complex politics of Beijing. The main beneficiaries we know are Jiang Zemin, Li Peng to some extent, Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, He Guoqiang, Wang Zhaoguo also. Yeah, so Jiang Zemin was just the most shameless probably but it worked for him. So here's some data. So you look at the share of Princeling in the Central Committee, both as full member and as both full and alternate members, the percentage never went above 7%. That was achieved at the 17th Party Congress. If you look at the combined full and alternate member list for the Central Committee, it exceeded 4% by a little bit. So not a high percentage of Princelings, given that there's over 1,000 of them, however you want to define it. The result is that Princelings were better networked. They had larger factions than non-Princelings. So among the Princelings who did make it into the Politburo, they had larger factions than non-Princelings. So that means that they had an advantage over the non-Princelings. And this graph already is a little bit skewed because it didn't take into account some of the non-Princelings that were closely associated with Princelings, like Zhou Yongkang. If you reclassify Zhou Yongkang as a Princeling, then the difference is a lot bigger, actually. And then the result is this, right? So 17th Party Congress was when Xi Jinping was chosen to be the successor of Hu Jintao. The red bars represent the Princelings. The textured blue bars are people that would have to retire by the 18th Party Congress anyway, so they don't really matter. The blue bars were the non-Princelings. Among the Princelings, Liu Yandong had the largest faction in the party. The problem was that Liu Yandong is a woman, and as a woman, there is a hard glass ceiling for women at the Politburo level. No woman in the history of the Chinese Communist Party has ever ended up in the Politburo Standing Committee, much less the chairman of the party. The reason for that, we can get into in the Q&A. It's a complex and sad history, I would say. Next was Li Yuanchao. So Li Yuanchao had a very large faction. And indeed, at the 17th Party Congress, Li Yuanchao was the biggest competitor against Xi Jinping. Then you have Xi Jinping and Yu Zhengsheng, who also has a faction of similar size as Xi Jinping. The problem with Yu Zhengsheng was that his brother defected to the United States, so he can never be the head of the party. Wang Qishan was a bit too old at that time to be the next leader of China. And then finally, Bo Xilai. So Bo Xilai, I would contend, was never a direct challenger to Xi Jinping because his faction was a lot smaller than that of Xi Jinping, and he never could have challenged Xi Jinping. The real competition for Xi Jinping at the 17th Party Congress was Li Yuanchao. The rumor is that at the 18th Party Congress, Xi Jinping asked for one thing. He's like, if you want me to be leader, then you cannot promote Li Yuanchao into the Politburo Standing Committee. Indeed, that happened. And there was really no one to challenge Xi Jinping after that. So that's the kind of, basically, because what happened in the 1980s, you end up with this alignment at the Politburo Standing Committee level at the 17th Party Congress, which determined what happened in the 18th Party Congress. And then after that, after Li Yuanchao was not allowed to be promoted, Xi Jinping could basically, rule the party as he wished, without anyone pushing back. Is Xi Jinping pursuing a coalition of the weak strategy today? Here's a quick graph to show that not really. So again, you can see these are either current or potential Politburo Standing Committee members today. Most of them have a pretty decent sized faction, that's 8 to 10% of the elite. In fact, you have some people like Li Shih that are have pretty large factions, even today larger than Xi's own faction. And the reason is because basically Xi Jinping is older, and when your factions are people who are your peers, as the chairman of the party, he doesn't have to retire, but the people who are his peers, his age group, they have to retire. So then one's faction naturally shrinks over time. You have other pretty people with like large factions, like Hu Chunhua, who's not in Xi Jinping's faction. His faction is fairly large. Also, let's see who else. Chen Minar is okay. Li Keqiang, though, has weakened quite a bit from the 2018 to 2021 period to today, 2022. Li Keqiang's faction has shrunken quite a bit. I think that's by design. So I think Hu Chunhua is still, and Li Xi are the people, and also Wang Yang. So Wang Yang, Hu Chunhua, and Li Xi are the three politicians to look out for at the 20th Party Congress, because what happens to them will kind of determine at the highest level whether there will be some kind of balance against Xi Jinping's power. Anyway, that is my talk. Yeah, so the conclusion is that, basically, institutions alone can't solve this information asymmetry problem. Instead, leaders will pursue coalition of the weak to ensure their survival. But in China, at least for a while, because Mao pursued coalitions of the weak, it led to a period of power sharing, because no one was powerful enough to overpower the other. But that in itself created a political vacuum, which a new dictator can emerge in. Anyway, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shih, Victor. This has really been given me so much to think about, and it's really exciting. I love the interdisciplinary aspect here, because thinking and hearing from the political science perspective is really exciting. I wanted to just add sort of an anecdotal note. I want to thank my brothers for logging on. Both I have a book club with my brothers Aaron and Tim and a friend Will, and we're reading Shakespeare, and we're reading Julius Caesar right now. And we last night talked about what everybody's favorite quotes were, and my brother's favorite quote was, "Let me have men about me that are fat, sleek-headed men, and such as sleep of nights. Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous." So that's sort of, the Mark Antony kind of character. He loves the pleasures of the flesh, and therefore seems to Shakespeare like he's potentially, he's not too hungry, not too ambitious, and so there's sort of he's sort of reliant in some ways on wherever the party is, but that idea is such a fascinating one, and I want to welcome everybody. I have questions here, but before I pull rank, I also want to welcome everybody to either raise hands. You can raise your hand, or you can type in the chat, and we will have a discussion here, conversation with Professor Shih. While we're waiting, I just wanted to note this idea of authoritarian blindness, sort of the emperor's new clothes idea, and to what extent that happens. When you say coalitions of the weak, and I'm just digging into your book now, so this may be developed in the book, but it doesn't necessarily mean coalitions of the incompetent, right? So I think sort of good governance defined within coalitions of the weak is sort of, the weak are precarious and they are reliant on the favor of that person in power, but it doesn't, I think my sort of hasty reading of the title was just put any buffoons in power, but weak doesn't necessarily mean they're incompetent. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I do want to separate my argument. There's another argument kind of closely related in political science, this competence loyalty trade-off. And actually, I don't think it's close at all. Like, what I would say is there's no such thing as loyalty in authoritarian politics. Anyone can betray anybody. But competence, in terms of competence, you can have technically very knowledgeable people, but they're politically very weak. But the result is that they are less effective in policy implementation sometimes, and certainly in taking policy initiatives, right? So that is, they're so afraid of deviating from what the dictator would have them do that if they see something wrong, A, they may not report it to the dictator. B, even if they report it to the dictator, they don't dare to do anything until the dictator says, okay, you need to fix this problem by doing A, B, and C. So that also will slow down the reaction to a policy problem, and potentially let some long-standing problems fester. So you saw this certainly in the late Mao period, and some would argue that you're seeing this again today in China. So it's they can be very knowledgeable, but they're still going to be less effective because they're so weak.
And so the stability and continuity are not everything, right? There needs to be this sort of effectiveness of governance. But in this system, stability and continuity are huge. I mean, it seems to be near the top. If anybody wants to jump in, please do. Please raise hands, jump in the chat. In the meantime, I'm happy to monopolize Victor here. I'm interested in going back to the 50s, because I've looked a little bit at the anti-localism campaigns, particularly from Hainan, but also there's Gaogang in the Northeast and others. But that the eradication or the sort of uprooting of local leaders seems to fit, because they may be very effective, but they're, for example, Feng Baiju in Hainan is a very small case that I know about. He's moved to Zhejiang and he does really well there. He doesn't speak the local dialect, but his leadership skills are transferred to a few important roles that he undertakes there. So that old imperial practice of the rule of avoidance or the law of avoidance fits here too, because people are very precarious when they're fish out of water and when they're moved around, right?
Yeah. So so this is moving away from your native province or county. That's a very old practice, as you know. All the dynasties did it. So these local guerrilla fighters who became officials, the ones who were able to stay, they were not allowed to be promoted, but they were always a second in command, third in command. But I don't know why. So in Guangdong province proper, there was this other guy who was treated just terribly in the 1950s, accused of localism, whereas other people like Feng Baiju, they were just moved. But anyway, so in the early 50s, when this all was happening to these local guerrilla fighters, Mao's main strategy was divide and conquer. So as long as all the different factions were balancing against each other, things were fine. But what that meant was the local guerrilla fighters, they were not part of any of the big factions. So it's like the big factions were like the 1st Field Army, 2nd Field Army, 3rd Field Army, 4th Field Armies. The local guerrilla fighters in Zhejiang, in Hainan, in Guangdong, they were just not in that system. So they hardly could take, I mean, some of them did take some provincial level positions, but then they were quickly sort of elbowed out. So that's a very interesting history, actually. People have written books on pieces of that, but not on the overall logic of, sort of what happened there. So the balancing between all the big factions was enough in that period. But then in the book, what it says is basically the Great Leap Forward was such a political shock to Chairman Mao. He was seen as infallible before the Great Leap Forward. Then 30 million people starved to death. The blame kind of lands on him because he pushed for the Great Leap Forward. People started criticizing him, and he had to get rid of them, basically, to stay in power. And then that became a whole different logic. But interestingly, when the major factions were being eliminated, it then created room for some of these local guerrilla fighters. So I did some research on Zhejiang, like on these 地方游击队, type cadres. They were fine during the Cultural Revolution, interestingly. Because the 1st Field Army people, they were getting purged and, so they ended up being okay. Or the 4th Field Army people in Hangzhou, like all these Hangzhou, Shandong cadres who came to Hangzhou, occupied all the senior positions. They were getting purged left and right, and some of the guerrilla fighters were left standing.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I just got it stuck in my mind, this sort of buffoon idea, and it's not. Yeah, if they're getting the job done. I'm interested, and maybe because we have you here, and this is such a in terms of the 20th Party Congress coming up, and sort of next steps in PRC politics are what a lot of people are thinking about, and you are really one of the go-to people to discuss this. I'd like to ask you a little bit about what you feel we can expect over the coming months. I think these sort of continuity and stability questions hold true, except when they don't. So there's Lin Biao and there's Bo Xilai, and when there's upheaval, and there's some way of moving through this. But there are these moments in the last 50 years of really dramatic upheaval as well. So I guess it's just sort of an open question in terms of what you see happening over the coming months, the coming weeks, the coming months, in terms of the developments.
Yeah, so there'll be a 20th Party Congress. Will begin October 16th. They announced it already. It's all but certain that Xi Jinping is going to be re-elected as the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party. He will get another 5-year term. We found out that the party constitution will be revised. And I got all excited, like, oh, does it mean that he's going to name a successor? Because that's what Chairman Mao did. He revised the constitution and say, Wang Hongwen, or someone is going to be my successor. It turns out that probably will not happen. He's not going to name a successor. It looks like from the press report on the revision of the constitution is that it's mainly ideological. So it's going to say that 2 systems of thoughts of Xi Jinping. So you have the Xi Jinping new era socialism of the Chinese characteristics that was enshrined already at the 19th Party Congress. At the 20th Party Congress, there's another thing, I don't even know what it is. That's going to be enshrined as a great and powerful thought. So that it's not going to be naming a successor, unfortunately. But if this is a big issue that needs to be resolved somehow, right? Because Xi Jinping is relatively young, we can say at the age of 69. but he's just getting older and older. His health is gonna, not improve that much necessarily over time. It's gonna stay the same or could worsen. And China is a large country and needs the leader. So at some point he'll have to name one. The problem is that if you look at Chairman Mao, the first three successors that he named either died horribly or ended up spending the rest of his life in jail. Right. So Liu Shaoqi, Lin Biao died horribly. And then Wang Hongwen, his third successor, ended up in jail for the rest of his life. Hua Guofeng finally ended up okay. He was sidelined, whatever, pretty good outcome. So no one wants to be his first successor. Like if I gave it to you, Jeremy, would you want the job?
The first drafts. Nobody wants to be the first.
Yeah, no one wants to be, because that person is going to die. So no one wants the job. And he doesn't want to make it so clear because, if you make it so clear, that person may become too powerful and so on and so forth. So this is, what I fear is that this is not a problem for the next year. This is a problem sort of 5-10 years from now, is that it doesn't get resolved until it has to be resolved when Xi Jinping is very sick or very old. But by then it's kind of too late, because no credible person will come out. No one will have enough power to actually take charge of China. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party and the military is very complex. To control the whole thing is extremely complex.
You gesture to a concept that I think is really interesting to foreign observers, especially, but also obviously within China, and that is a question of feminism and gender representation within elite Chinese politics. And this is, this is something that's striking, obviously, in terms of the political theater and the optics of these kind of meetings. But you reference a sort of a hard glass ceiling. Are there any signs of at the elite level or at the elite media level, in terms of popular media, of opposition or resistance to the reluctance to have women in the highest echelons of power, or is this simply a no-go for anyone to discuss?
So people are starting to complain about it, women who are in the Chinese government, but of course they're not allowed to organize and make their voices heard because that is illegal in China and within the Chinese Communist Party. The people lodge complaints through the All China Federation of Women, but there's a huge literature showing that the All China Federation of Women serves the party first and serves women second, as a second or third or fourth priority. It's not high in the pecking order. The depressing thing is that, so currently in the Central Committee, which is again like the Congress of China, there's like 6% women. That ratio is lower than most countries in the world across, income level, across, dominant religions of these countries. It is just the lowest ratio in the entire world. And if you look at younger, so then you're like, oh, well, let's look at the younger cohorts. Maybe there are more women, those who were born after 1962, the ratio is basically the same. Also, I think it's a little bit higher. It's like 8%, instead of 6% is 8%, still less than 10%. It's abysmal. I mean, it's been 40 years since the reform and opening. You would think at least, even if there's some movement toward gender equality, in fact, what happened was there were more women in the Central Committee at the very beginning of reform because Jiang Qing promoted a lot of women into the Central Committee as alternate members. They were then removed, of course, by the mid-1980s, and they were not replaced with women. They were replaced with men. So the ratio dropped, and it's been pretty steady ever since.
And it doesn't seem like there's sort of change on the horizon. When I speak with some Chinese friends, I occasionally hear them say, what do you think about this, zhengzhi, this sort of American political correctness thing? Because it seems to me that what we'd call, social justice, or what people deride as political correctness, but it's fundamentally fighting for social justice in this country, is seen as a potentially destabilizing force and a weakening force for leaders. That is the left, for perhaps the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is perceived by some I've spoken with in China as sort of weakening the Democratic Party from being this sort of solid, Putin-esque kind of a party that can get things, or Xi Jinping kind of party that can get things done domestically. It doesn't seem that there are signs of light on this, because stability and continuity, and then also the narrative of the fall of the Soviet Union took such hold. I think I think there was a reference to the leadership not being manly enough, and this being sort of the reason for the fall of the Soviet Union. So there doesn't seem to be signs of hope or progress on that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, in terms of representation, it's bad news all across the board. The share of ethnic minorities declined, not by a lot, but somewhat, from 2012 to today. Actually, there was huge decline in Uyghur cadres in the Central Committee, related to the crackdown and repression in Xinjiang, I'm sure, but also because I think part of the reason is, like, before, the party needed Uyghur cadres to represent the Uyghurs and to use them to maintain stability. Now stability is completely sort of maintained by force and by surveillance, that these Uyghurs are not needed anymore in the higher echelon. So there's that logic going on there. Geographically, also, these Central Committee members are Han male from North Central China. So Daniel Koss, who's now at Harvard, wrote this really interesting book on the distribution of party membership in 1949 across different regions of China compared to today. So in 1949, basically, the communists had these base area, as you know, very concentrated in, Hebei, Henan, Anhui, some parts of Liaoning province, some parts of Hainan, as you pointed out, tiny parts of Guangdong province. Well, Guangdong was pretty much cleaned out, by the KMT by that point. Rural Fujian, still a little bit action. Even today, these northern central provinces is still where there are a lot of Chinese Communist Party members. And so you have relatively low representation from Guangdong province, from Fujian province, even from Guangxi province. Despite some of the Hainan's glorious revolutionary history, not a lot of Hainan cadres have come up to the top that I know of. Unfortunately, maybe that will change. Once it becomes a free trade zone, everything will change. Hainan will finally get its glorious. So basically, geographically, ethnically, in terms of gender, you have a Central Committee body that's mainly of Han male from northern central provinces, governing over, which is at best like maybe 20% of China's population. I think it's actually in the teens. So there's like people from that group governing over all of China, more or less. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's a great insight on that. Yeah, I guess Li Peng doesn't count. His father died on Hainan. Li Shuoxun. He was sent there to make get everybody in order there, and he died within a few months, or within a few weeks.
Few weeks. Oh, that's where he died. I did not know that. Okay.
He was and sort of aspersions were cast at the local Hainanese communists, saying,
We're
you know,
allowing that to happen.
yeah, right. Is this, you know, Dalu Laida is
Yeah, I don't know if it was an accident or what. Yeah, some of these things.
it's a very, yeah, that's an interesting story to dig into. So I don't think Li Peng counts as an adopted Hainanese. He never went there. His father just met his end there. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I just want to remind our attendees, none of who, Rassandra had a question about historical fiction. I don't know if you're a fan of historical fiction, but are there some novels that maybe in translation?
Well, so there is a great movie that I urge everyone to watch. It's called To Live, directed by Zhang Yimou, and it really tells the communist revolution, especially the success of it and the consequences of it quite well, you know, from the perspective of an ordinary Chinese family. So the revolution, the successful revolution did transform Chinese society. This corrupt landlord family became, you know, a good, clean living revolutionary family. But then, of course, they were affected by wave after wave of political movement after that. So really, To Live, I don't know if it's on Netflix or what, but it's pretty easy to watch.
It's actually on YouTube, and
so YouTube, the whole movie.
And it's legal. I think that the
Right.
distributor gave up the rights. I've been using it for a while, and I've put it there in the chat for everybody. I also,
Yeah.
it's a fantastic film. Really,
The other good movie for Chinese politics is called The Chinese Mayor. I think this one is on Netflix. It's about the mayor of somewhere in Shanxi province, Datong, the mayor of Datong. I think the English title is called The Mayor. But I don't know if you can find it. It's, if you Google like Mayor of Datong movie, you'll see it. But it's a documentary. Like this film crew just follow the mayor of Datong and just witness what he does on a day-to-day basis. And this is a guy who ended up being arrested, of course, for corruption later on.
Yeah, I just found it and put at least the wiki page in there.
Yeah.
For everybody. And I want to actually recommend one more movie. I don't know if you'll agree, Vic,
please,
but Tian Zhuang's Blue Kite.
Blue Kite. Yes, I saw that a long time ago.
Devastating. A woman who, a mother, she's a single mother, and the father dies, the little boy grows up with the mother sort of, and really interesting on gender dynamics as well, because she sort of attaches herself to different men for different reasons and sort of strategic. And then the Lao Geming gets hit in the Cultural Revolution. She finally marries a powerful local official just in time for him to get knocked down in the Cultural Revolution. So devastating film. Of course, To Live and Blue Kite were both banned. Got the makers in a lot of trouble. Although Zhang Yimou is definitely dusted off.
Making money hand over fist, organizing these Olympic ceremonies, and
he dusted himself off, and he's
in terms of novels, wait, what's the one about the Korean War prisoners of war? I can't think of this one. I'm not the biggest reader of literature. I do have to confess. I read a lot of like mystery novels and spy novels and such, but like there's a new one. If you want a spy novel that's supposedly like real, I'm using it to prop up my computer right now. This one's called The China Hand. Just came out by Scott Spacek. Sorry, it's like a blurry. Oh, here we go. It's supposedly fiction. I don't know. You might like it because this is a guy like who went to China in the 1990s. So kind of around the time when I first went to China to study abroad. So it mentions all the same bars used to go to and stuff like that. But it's supposedly not entirely fiction. So it makes it kind of interesting.
Nice. And I'll send one as well. And I just put that in the chat if anybody's interested in that, the China Hand spy novel. And I've got a note there for a review of Please Don't Call Me Human, which is a
Oh yeah, that's right. Please don't come in. Yes, that's the one. Yes, on the
That's-
Korean War veterans. Yeah. Oh, the prisoners of war.
yeah, that, well, there's I think that's a different one. But
Oh,
this
it's
one is about sort of Chinese national identity, and then and leading up to the Olympics. Speaking of Zhang Yimou and the Olympics, and sort of
right.
very different book than something that could be written now.
Wang Shuo, right.
Yeah, Wang Shuo, that's right. Han is a writer to check out as well, Rasandra, if you're interested in sort of interesting voice. Although I haven't followed his work over the last couple of years, and things move so fast that he may be a very different person than he was last I checked. So I'm not sure. Like Zhang Yimou, these things, the ground moves under their feet, and suddenly, Zhang Yimou, Ai Weiwei, they're taking up different kinds of space.
Yeah. Well, the temptations are just so large.
Yeah.
Like Zhang Yimou, I mean, who knows how much money he makes, and all he has to do is to keep his mouth shut,
Yeah, and make beautiful things. They're definitely. He's a cinematographer, so they are beautiful.
Exactly.
We are at the 12:15 mark. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and really I want to thank Dr. Victor Shih for joining us from UCSD. It's been an absolute pleasure. We could talk all day about novels and everything else. This has really been a wonderful talk, and I will share the recording, and I'll also share these recommendations as well with anybody who'd like. Victor, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you.
I'll follow up with you, Victor.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.